Hello, and welcome to another episode of To the Edge. This time it's going to be the edge of nostalgia. Today we'll be discussing the 90s.
The 90s, it's funny.
Yes.
I am Mike Messier, your co-host, and this is...
Roland Khorshidi-Zada.
Yep.
Say that 5 times fast. Can you say that's 5 times fast?
Roland...
No, just the last name.
Khorshidi-Zada, 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 Khorshidi-Zada. I was born on a pirate ship. Okay,
There you go.
something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, I was listening to WBRU, which is a very popular radio station down in Providence, Rhode Island area, Roland,
Yeah.
driving up here, because this is driving, and I realized they were having this nostalgia week, and they were playing only 90s music. Of course, this station usually plays pretty much 90s music,
Yeah.
with a little bit of current stuff mixed in, but I was thinking about the music, and some of this stuff like REM, Everybody Hurts, and different songs from that era were kind of very self-pitying, self-analyzing,
Right.
self-worshipping almost. What do you think about that?
Well, on the one hand, that's kind of like an inflated ego. On the other hand, they were complaining about things when it was really a good time when people look back on it. I mean, people who thought their lives were so miserable in the 90s, I bet they're really pining for those days now.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we talked about it. Is ever since basically 9/11, or even before that, some milestones basically put an end to the decade that was the 90s. And for you, you were saying that your own life had some special, you know, monuments of those time frames.
Right. There's a very clear division for me between the 90s and the 2000s because, well, first of all, you had the election of Bush, then you had the dot-com bubble burst, then you had this slight economic downturn, which is nothing compared to the one we had in 2008, but it was still conceived of as major at the time. And then that was the same year, fall 2001, that I actually started going to Bridgewater and I met a lot of the people who I know now. So it was like the end of one era in September of 2001 and the beginning of another. And then a few months after that, you had the release of Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter in the theaters. So to me, that was really the beginning of a new era.
Right.
How about you?
Well, the 90s were just a long decade for me. I mean, a lot of stuff happened, and it's funny because we talk about the 1990s, and it's like, well, you started the decade with FUBU pants and loud colors and Hoomp There It Is, you know,
Yeah.
and then you kind of ended the decade with I don't know what. I mean, grunge was kind of coming to an end because
Yeah, that had already faded out by 99.
yeah, because Cobain had been, you know, in his death mode for a while, so to speak. And you know, when we come to the end of the 90s, I think we had, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't George Bush, the second Bush, kind of getting into office by then? Unless
Well, he ran in 2000 and then was elected into office in January 2001.
right.
So, no, 1999 was the whole Clinton impeachment thing with Monica Lewinsky and the Starr Report.
Yep.
And it was anticlimactic that nothing really happened to Clinton afterwards.
Well, yeah, and it's just funny that we think about things like politics, like Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. That was the big deal, you know,
Yeah.
back then. But now that would be just a good laugh
Yeah.
at this day and age. So I'd be like, all right, Bill, all right, Monica, you know,
Right.
go for it. You know, have a cigar on me. But back then it was a real sad state. But just
yeah.
you know, so many things in the 90s. We
Yeah.
made little notes, but I mean, we talk about, I think we started the decade with a little bit of a Gulf War, right? Like that.
Yeah, it was a 4-day war. I mean, that's nothing like today where Afghanistan were 12 years and counting.
Yeah, and we actually won the 4-day war too, so that was
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah, just go in, drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, end of story.
Right.
No regime change or anything like that.
It's just funny because, I mean, you look at the 90s, so much stuff happened, you know, and a lot of it, from my own sensibility, was following the pop culture world and,
Yeah.
you know, wrapped up in that. But then you had things, you know, like the O.J. Simpson that took us through 3 or 4 or 5 years almost from, I think, June of '94 that incident, that murder or whatever you want to call it happened. And
Right.
it just dragged and dragged, and people really just enjoyed watching that.
That was considered a big deal. I was in high school at the time, and classes, we didn't have classes. We just had the TV in front when the verdict was given, and everyone just sat there, and then we saw the not guilty, and then everyone, teachers and students alike, they talked about it for an hour afterwards. We didn't even have class.
Wow.
And then one of the teachers said this is probably one of the most satirical things that we'll see. So that shows you how good things were back in the 90s, that we're obsessed with a murder case.
Right, right. I mean, yeah, 2 people getting killed, but I guess there were some ramifications as far as, you know, what constitutes a fair trial and what constitutes race issues and all that stuff. And I mean, it was loaded because you had an interracial couple, you had a murder, you had kids involved to an extent, you know, because O.J. and Nicole had kids together, and then you had. What was the guy's name? The
Kato
guy,
Kaelin.
Kato Kaelin. He was good for a laugh, wasn't
Yep, I'm old.
he? Yeah, it's Kato Kaelin. So, you know, at the beginning of the decade, Roland, it seemed like, as far as music goes, freedom of speech, just watch what you say. As I think Ice-T, the rapper turned actor, would say, freedom of speech was a big deal in the 90s as far as bands like the 2 Live Crew. 2 Live is what we are. They were a personal favorite of mine. Ice-T, like I said, Ice Cube, you know, some of these guys, the rap.
Snoop Dogg.
Snoop Dogg. Well, you know, was Snoop Dogg political? Well, he kind of had a...
Not really. It was more like on the street.
Right.
But still. I mean, that's a form of politics because that shows the world, even though people didn't want to acknowledge that that world existed.
Well, Snoop Dogg had a murder trial himself. He was charged with something. He got acquitted for that. But then we had the whole deal with parental guidance stickers and heavy metal music. That was right at the beginning of the decade, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Tipper Gore was really concerned about the content of lyrics and not heavy metal, but with rap. There was a song called F the Police.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Was that by the NWA, by NWA band? I think so.
I think so, I'm not sure. But I do remember that was a song.
Yes.
And that's fairly political or making a statement.
Right. And you had Cop Killer by Ice-T.
Yeah, Cop Killer.
Cop Killer, Better You Than Me. Cop Killer was a loaded album. It was actually, I owned a copy for whatever reason, and Ice-T was making some waves, and then ironically he would go on to be an actor, I think, on Law and Order, if I'm not mistaken, and play a cop. So,
Yeah.
you know, just an interesting guy as far as everything. I was a fan of Ice-T. I still am. I think he's an interesting performer.
I don't know if Common was a rapper in the 90s, but he's a rapper now, and he's actually on the show Hell on Wheels.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Western on AMC.
Nice. Not familiar with his work.
You should see it.
Okay. So, what else can we talk about the 90s? We just couldn't blare through this thing, you know. Just so much. So much. What is the audience? Well,
Quentin Tarantino.
Quentin Tarantino. He was a big 90s guy.
Reservoir Dogs.
Reservoir Dogs, yeah. He came on strong. You know, he came on strong with the independent film scene and really made a statement, you know, with Reservoir Dogs.
And then Pulp Fiction, through that, I think that John Travolta really made his career comeback, and I think it put Samuel L. Jackson on the map, because before that, you'd see him in Jurassic Park, you're like, who's this guy?
Right.
And then his persona was just born with Pulp Fiction, I think.
I think you're right. Yeah, Jules, you know, and
He's my favorite character in the film.
oh yeah, I kind of like Bruce Willis's scene as a child. So it wasn't even Bruce Willis, but The Watch with Christopher Walken. And do you do a Christopher Walken impersonation? Because I don't. Do you?
No, I don't think I want to do that.
Okay.
I was about to, but I'm worried that I'll mess it up.
Yeah, I mean, so many people can do a good Walken that I'll try. Butch, he is the father's. That's like somebody else. That's not even.
I saw him in Batman Returns,
Yeah.
and I thought that he looked kind of like Andrew Jackson in that film.
Nice. Oh yeah, speaking of the Batman movies, we didn't even make that in our notes, but those first, I think '89, going back to that decade, was the first Michael Keaton, Tim Burton Batman movie, and you're more of an expert than I am, but turn of the decade, we started seeing, I think maybe in 90 or 91 or 92 even, Batman Returns with Michelle Pfeiffer.
That was 92.
Okay, 92, and then you had, you could name them more than I could. But
and then there was Batman Forever in the mid-90s when Joel Schumacher took over, and that's when the film franchise took a major downturn, but no one noticed it until Batman and Robin.
Right.
Yeah.
And you had George Clooney in the mix, and Nicole Kidman, and you had Arnold Schwarzenegger. I can do Schwarzenegger almost.
Arnold! He was big in the 90s.
It's not the tumor. I'm in the Batman movie as Mr. Freeze.
It's not a tumor. Terminator 2.
Terminator 2 was a 90s movie, 1991, I believe.
Yeah.
And that was huge.
And it took place in 1994.
Did it really?
Yeah, it did.
Oh, boy.
10 years after John Connor was born.
we can go with the Terminator movie because you had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was big, real
Yeah.
big in the 90s, with that movie and with some other movies. And that's a very vague statement. That movie and some other movies.
Linda Hamilton.
Linda Hamilton was fierce. I mean, she's extremely attractive in a very G.I. Jane type of way, really.
Yeah. Yeah, we should have mentioned her in our last episode.
Oh yeah, when we had we had four beautiful ladies
Yes.
talking about I Am Monroe, but we Linda Hamilton and then you had Guns N' Roses did a song for the Terminator 2 soundtrack, You Could Be
Yeah.
Mine, and there's so many offshoots of Terminator 2 we can get into them. But as far as that movie itself, I thought it was a great movie. I saw it 3 times in the theater. What about you?
I was 11 or 12 at the time, so I didn't see it in the theater.
Yeah.
I saw it on request. Yes, in those days, request was our version of on demand.
Right. Oh yeah, I mean, and well, I guess cable TV was already big in the '80s, but in the '90s it got even further. And
Yeah.
Well-
I got cable in 1989, so the very end of the decade. Then a VCR in 1990.
I'm trying to think if there was any technological. Did cell phones become big in the late '90s?
No, pages were big back then.
Pagers.
I mean, if it was in the 90s, it would have been like 99, almost 2000, because I didn't really see them around until the early 2000s.
Right.
I myself personally didn't have a cell phone until 2004, so I was very late to that.
It's okay. So we have talking about that. I mean, let's go back to Guns N' Roses if we could, because I'm a big fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
They had that whole double album deal with. I think it came out in September of '91, right around the time that Nirvana came out. So it was kind of
Yeah.
interesting. You had the holdover from the late '80s, Appetite for Destruction. Guns N' Roses coming back strong with Use Your Illusion
Yeah.
1 and 2. You had to buy them both.
Yeah.
And then you had a band like Nirvana coming on, from Seattle, a totally different approach to music, seemingly. And
I was very, very young, obviously, but what was your reaction to Nirvana?
I thought they were powerful. I thought they were powerful. I thought it was a great sound. It didn't really occur to me that at the time they had this whole new outlook on things, but I just thought the sound of it was great, and it was very powerful and loud. It was different. I mean, at the time, the loudest thing that I liked was an AC/DC type of band with Thunderstruck and something like that.
Right.
But hearing Nirvana with Smells Like Teen Spirit, it was the type of music that made you want to shoulder block somebody in a mosh pit. It made you
Yeah.
want to be aggressive and angry, mean.
That's another thing. The music of the early to mid 90s was very, very aggressive. And I noticed that after Nirvana died with post-grunge, they kind of really toned down grunge music to make it almost more commercial and marketable.
Right.
I mean, listen to the grunge or the post-grunge of the late 90s. I mean, it sounds a lot more tame than early grunge or any of the hair metal.
Yeah, you had a band like Bush, for instance, with Machine Head and some of that.
Oh, I remember Machine Head.
And Bush,
No, yeah.
they made some good music, but ultimately they did seem a little contrived or overproduced to me anyway. But they were
Or like 1979 by Smashing Pumpkins.
Smashing Pumpkins.
That was laid back.
Yeah, well, they took over kind of from where Nirvana left off, didn't they? They
Yeah.
and actually in a very graphic way, when Cobain died, they were scheduled to headline Lollapalooza. I remember this, and basically the band that took over that spot was the Smashing Pumpkins. So they kind of took that torch and ran with it as far as the go-to band for the angst-ridden population.
Then there was Alyssa Morissette. I think
Oh,
that's her
yeah.
name. You ought to know.
Alanis Morissette, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, she brought together, and I shouldn't laugh because she's very, very talented, but she brought this whole female perspective, and she added the female angst, and
Yeah.
You Ought to Know, and made you think about movie theaters in a different type of way, obviously, and that was very
Yeah.
proficient and profound in her own way, and you had like female singers like I was going to say Sheryl Crow, but I'm not sure when she came out. Pretty 90-ish.
Yeah,
didn't she?
that's 90s.
Yeah.
Or like I'm a Bee. Yeah, you can't really talk about 90s music without using expletives.
Right.
That
And-
kind of goes back to earlier what we were talking about with the lyrics and getting political and being controversial.
Yeah. And you had Natalie Merchant, who kind of
Yeah.
she's almost timeless. She had such a nice voice and such a range. That I can't quantify her as just a '90s performer, but that's when she hit big. And you had I guess the Dixie Chicks. Going into
Yeah.
that pop culture country. What a decade, you know?
Yeah.
Just sit here and just yap about it. What else? What else, Roland?
And then on the pop side, you had like Hanson and Sync.
Bop. And,
Yeah, I remember they used to be all over the Pop Tarts cartons that I used to buy back then. I was like, I don't even listen to this.
I knew a girl who actually had a thing for one of the Bop guys, and I thought that was a little disturbing. But what are you gonna do?
Well, hopefully it was the older one.
I didn't ask. I was I just stayed away.
But there's TV too. There's Seinfeld, The Simpsons.
Oh yeah. Well, the Seinfeld show I think came out in '92, didn't it?
No, it actually started in 90.
'90. Wow, going all the way back.
Yeah, 90 to 98.
Yep. And it had a great run, and that show holds up pretty well, I think.
Yeah, it
the
does.
reruns, and you had such great character development, such great acting, you know, in the storylines and so on and so forth.
Well, did the characters really develop? They seem to me like archetypes.
They seemed almost undeveloped because because I was watching a rerun last night from one of the earlier seasons,
Yeah.
and there was a whole storyline of Elaine and Jerry talking about how they were in a relationship, and now their relationship has unfolded. So can they flirt with other people in each other's company? And you know, I could barely remember that was part of the opening seasons, was that they had this whole ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend dynamic. You know, by the time they got into the third or fourth season, it seemed like that had gone the way of the wind, so to speak.
And then in the middle of the decade, you had Friends and ER and shows like that.
Friends and Friends was a huge hit, you know. And,
Yeah.
and it was kind of like that whole coffee house scene, you know, which really blossomed in the '90s in reality, but also, you know, in this TV show Friends, and it just was a starting point for a lot of big actors, you know. Jennifer Aniston, probably the big breakout star, but even some of the other stars in that show.
Matt LeBlanc.
Right, Lisa Kudrow did all right for herself.
Or there was the Rachel haircut. Rachel.
Yeah. But Jennifer Aniston kind of took it. And, you know, talking about Jennifer Aniston, the '90s, as far as big-time movie stars, Brad Pitt was big. Still is. Yeah.
But he was bigger back then.
He was bigger back then. He came on pretty strong with a lot of movies. Once again, vague, but a lot of movies. Was Fight Club late '90s?
99.
Okay,
it qualifies.
Yep. So Fight Club and anything he did before that. Interview with the Vampire, for instance.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about the 90s in general with the songs. Why do you think people were so angry? What did they have to be upset about?
That's a good point. I was trying to think about that, and I'll think about it some more on camera. But why were people so angry in the '90s? It kind of seems like we had nothing better to do. You know, it kind of seems like there was just nothing better. And then does anger sell? Does, you know, gazing at your own navel and wondering why it's there, does that sell music or TV or anything? And apparently it does.
So in the 21st century, you feel that would be different because people have ways to channel their anger.
Good point. Yeah, I like that because, you know, now we do have enemies, we do have conflict, you know, in our daily lives. We have to be looking over our shoulder, and the whole thing with where does personal rights or personal space come head to head with terrorism, you know, and stuff like that, and public safety versus private, you know, and now we get real serious about privacy and also threats of attack, you know, not only from outside forces but from inside people, you know. It's scary stuff, Roland, it really is.
Then to step out of the 90s and then go into the 2000s and 2010s then, do you think that because of the times are so much harder and not as prosperous as before, that's toned down entertainment or made it more escapist?
That's a great question. I would probably, off the top of my head, want to agree with that. I never thought about it that way. That's a great perspective. But yeah, you talk about escapism, and as you were saying, the Lord of the Rings trilogy seemed to enrapture a lot of people, you know, and The Hobbit. And so what do you do when our own world, for lack of a better term, sucks? You create a whole new world. You know, you create hobbits and labyrinths,
right?
You know, good stuff like that.
And even the violence, it's like this impossibly global scale that we're likely never to see. And all these films in the 21st century, they have these major evil villains who need to be taken down. But really the worst villains in this century are people who you can't just take down. There are real threats, and it'll take a long time to work our way through them, and you don't always know who it is. They don't announce themselves as, I am the villain. Right. That's not the way it works in this world.
Yeah, it's not.
And media doesn't reflect that.
Great stuff, Roland. I mean, it's true. Everything you're saying is true. I mean, for some reason, when you were talking just now, I was thinking of that song 1999 by our buddy Prince, you know,
yes.
which was actually a song from the 80s, ironically. But when the world's got a bomb, we could all die any day. Before that happens, I'll dance my life away, which is how I feel in my daily existence. You know?
That song was written and released in 1983,
Right.
and that was the height of the second wind of the Cold War.
Right. Right. And I guess, if I got my history straight, wasn't the end of the Cold War kind of Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev being buddies? So in the 90s, you know, you'd think that people would just come together and have a good time and more or less be happy, but
Yeah.
it didn't turn
Clinton
out that way.
and Yeltsin, they were on good terms. They were like best buds.
Yeah.
Compare that to a decade earlier when you had Reagan and Gorbachev's predecessor, and Reagan was like, oh, the Soviets, the evil empire.
Right.
And you had Rocky IV with the evil Russians. I was watching shows like Transformers where you had the Autobots who were a stand-in for the Americans and the Decepticons who were obviously a stand-in for the Soviets. So they were raising kids to think like us versus them, you know, Americans versus the Soviets. And then the Cold War ended, and then, you know, that put an end to that.
It's a great metaphor what you just said, you know, even kids' toys and kids' animation coming as a metaphor for society and what, I mean, I'd ask you, is G.I. Joe anything like that?
Yeah, it's the same. It's the same idea. Transformers, G.I. Joe, they were exactly the same. And then in the 90s, you didn't really have that. You had, I didn't really watch 90s cartoons, but it wasn't like one nation versus another. I think that the cartoons, they were friendlier, I think, during the 90s, which is a contrast to the music.
Right. Yeah, the music and you know, just going back to TV, and you had things like, in the beginning of the 90s for me, it was all about 90210, you know, these high school kids who were living these empowered lives with cars and you know, Brandon and Brenda and all these kids and Luke Perry and the Sideburns and just setting the whole, you know, we can kind of like take that lightly now, but at the time that was big stuff. You know,
I've got to tell you, I started high school in 1993, and right before I started high school, my uncle showed me an episode of 90210 because he wanted to tell me and show me what real high school was like. And it was nothing like that.
You're going to meet Brenda Walsh, and you're going to take her to the prom and all that good stuff.
Yeah, for one thing, none of them were actually teenagers. They're all 20-somethings playing teenagers. So it's like, how come no one in high school looks as old as these people?
Right.
And when I went, it wasn't 90210. It was more like Dangerous Minds, because I went to Brockton High.
Oh, God. That's good.
Yeah.
And then you had the spin-off, Melrose Place, which is even more vamped up with the fun sex and all that good stuff on Melrose.
Models Inc.
Models Inc. Oh, good memory. Good memory.
Silk Stockings on cable.
Duckman, you know, you had all types of good stuff.
I remember Renegade or Highlander.
Highlander, the TV series, sure.
Great theme song.
Yeah. Highlander, I'm a big Highlander fan. I don't remember the Highlander TV show theme song, do you?
Yeah, it was like, I am immortal. I'm not going to sing that on camera.
Yeah, no, that was Queen, right? I have inside me blood of kings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you had some of the more interesting, you know, multifaceted characters like well, I was going to say in sports, for me, it was the Michael Jordan decade, and not only sports, but also marketing with the sneakers.
For a lot of people.
Right. I mean, he won, I believe, in the 90s, he won 6 championships. I believe starting in 91, kept that going and won 3 in a row, took a couple of years off, came back and won 3. He just did whatever he wanted to do. You know?
He even did some films with the Looney Tunes.
Oh, yeah, the Space Jam.
Yeah, exactly.
But Michael Jordan was just a juggernaut, you know, in a good way. And a little quote that I like to use, Roland, when people, you know, think about Michael Jordan is, apparently the story goes, and you know, take this for what it's worth, but some political friends of Michael Jordan came to him and said, hey, we have this Democratic candidate that we'd like you to endorse.
Bill Clinton?
No, I think it was more like a regional,
okay.
like a regional election. And Michael Jordan asked a couple of questions, and they said, well, you know, he's really a good guy. And Jordan said, yeah, he sounds like a good guy, but Republicans buy sneakers too. You know, so Jordan did not endorse the candidate because he said, you know, Republicans buy sneakers too, and that's how I feel when I'm trying to promote myself. You know, you got to be careful. This is a different statement, but you got to be careful who you offend or who you isolate yourself from, because Republicans buy sneakers too, and Democrats buy ties. So
Yeah, there you go.
so what else we got?
Oh, I remember the 92 election. I was watching the debates, and you had Admiral Stockdale as Ross Perot's vice president. It was like a retired Navy admiral, and he needed a hearing aid, and they asked him a question. It was like, I don't have my hearing aid on.
And his first question is, he asked the audience, "You might be wondering, who am I and why am I here?" And was like,
Yeah.
"Yeah, we kind of are."
That was great.
Who am I? That election, the '92 with Clinton, Perot, and the original Bush, was just pretty interesting. Because I think for the first time, the one that won, Bill Clinton, did not have the majority of the popular vote.
That's right.
Because it was split 3 ways. And Perot, we talk about freedom of speech. A guy like Perot coming on as a third-party candidate.
A legitimate third-party candidate with real, gravitas, and he had full endorsements and major support.
That's right. That's right. Talking about major support, and this is a horrible segue, but as a pro wrestling fan, I couldn't go without mentioning that pro wrestling hit its big time money making stride.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of how that translated, but it did, because you had things like kids walking around with NWO, New World Order wrestling T-shirts, and DX, and
Right.
Stone Cold Steve Austin, and suddenly,
remember that.
Yeah, everything was Austin 316.
Oh, The Rock, he was the 90s, right?
The Rock was the late 90s, yeah. He came on around 97, 98, and he translated from a from a wrestler to a movie star. It's just kind of interesting that something as obscure on the margins of pro wrestling could jump in and just take over, for a couple of years anyway. Goldberg, so forth.
And he progressed as more of an actor as he went on. What was one of his first films he was in? I don't really remember.
The Mummy Returns.
Right.
Was The Rock's first, and then they made The Scorpion King, and then...
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of, The Scorpion King.
And then he did The Gridiron Gang, he did the remake of Walking Tall, and he was making money,
Yeah.
and it still is, but... I was also a boxing fan, Roland. I don't know if you were, but they had guys like everybody. You had your Evander Holyfield with the ear biting. You remember that at all?
I remember that.
Yeah.
I heard about that.
Mike Tyson bit his ear off, and
I didn't do nothing. Even though that had to do with a sexual harassment story.
Right.
That was another thing of the 90s. A lot of sexual harassment going on.
A lot of sexuals.
Which is not a good thing, by the way.
No,
I just want to clarify. But they had a lot of those stories going on back then.
Well, Mike Tyson was a polarizing character, because some people just loved the way he fought and loved the way he beat people up, and some people, kind of took issue with him, like, why is he biting somebody's ear off? Why is he in trouble with, the going to prison? Why is he having road rage? He had a road rage incident, apparently.
Wow.
He's basically a convicted rapist is what it comes down to, and people still love him. Some people do. And it's just an interesting situation with that guy.
Yeah, all that aggression, it doesn't always stay in the ring.
No, it's a good point. What do you do when you're not fighting? You're still kind of fighting, in some regard, society or yourself or something, deep. So, what else can we talk about? Well, you had the grunge. We didn't even talk about the grunge.
Yeah, we didn't even get into it, really. Well, we did kind of earlier with Kurt Cobain and all that.
Right.
But who were your favorite grunge bands?
Well, you had Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, a bunch of good stuff. You had a band, I can't remember the name, but you had some good band. You had Mad Season was what I was thinking of. It was a tribute. It was a collaboration of different guys. I think we're running out of time, Roland.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
Well, then in that case, we're going to have to end this discussion of the 90s and go back to the 21st century.
Yep.
But before we do, are there any closing thoughts you want to talk about with the 90s as a whole?
Wish it was back, to be honest. I was going to say, I'm glad it's over. No, I wish we were back in the 90s. That's it. That's all I got.
Well, if I had known ahead of time that this was going to be a 90s show, I would have brought my vintage 90s clothing, because I still have some, and I was able to wear some now for the first time in a long time. I had a plaid shirt that I put on, and then someone was like, wow, that's a very cutting-edge shirt. And then I told him, yeah, glad you think so. I got that shirt in 1993.
Thanks for watching.
Yep. See you later.